this lady's name is Milan Piquet. Okay? I took 3 years of French. I took 2 years of high school French, which prepared me to do very poorly in my 1 year of required college French. I can speak fluid, perfect French. You ready? Ready? Her name is Milan Piquet. So here's how you pronounce it. Milan Piquet. Ha ha. That's how you pronounce anything in French. You add that on at the end of it. That is a French-Canadian lady. And her goal was to row from Canada to France. To row the North Atlantic. There had never been a North American woman to row the Atlantic unassisted. People had done it in teams. People had done it with teams before. People had done it with support groups. But no one had ever done this all by themselves. No woman from North America had ever done this all by themselves. So she decided in 2008, and she wasn't a rower. This wasn't her gig. She was a fit lady, but she was not an athlete like this. But she heard that this had never been done. She thought, why not me? She decides to train, and she spent 5 years training to row. I don't want to row across some pond. She wanted to row the Atlantic. 5,000 kilometers, which is a little over 3,000 miles. She trained for this, and she prepared for almost 5 years. She set off in June or July of 2013. Let me tell you a little bit about her trip. Her first goal was to row off the coast and get into the the air is called the jet stream. What is the ocean called? The current. Okay, she was hoping to get into the current. Unfortunately, in the first 2 months of her trip, she could actually row about 2 weeks of that 2 months. So for a month and a half of the first chunk of time that she was out on the water, for a month and a half of the first 2 months, she couldn't even row because the storms were so bad. 2 months into her trip, she was about halfway across the Atlantic. 2 months into the trip, she ran into Atlantic Storm Umberto, which is fun to say. That's not French. Atlantic Storm Umberto. She was about 1,500 miles and 2 months away from home, out in the middle of the Atlantic in a boat that size. That's all of her supplies for the entire trip. She capsized a total of 10 times. Now, the boat was built to right itself, but she dumped that boat repeatedly. In one day, in the middle of the big storm, in one day, she dumped that boat 3 times. She lost some of her supplies, including her sea anchor. The sea anchor is basically a big underwater sock that slows the boat down as it's going up ginormous Atlantic Ocean swells and coming down to gain a little bit of consistency and speed on that little boat. That sea anchor would help her. It was gone. She had 4 ways to communicate. She had satellite phone and cell phone, and she had a computer. She had 4 ways to communicate. 3 of them were lost in the storm. She was down to her last radio. And she calls for help. Now, imagine for a second. Now, I've never experienced isolation like this. I like to be alone sometimes. I like to be alone for a few hours, kind of gather my thoughts. I'm far more introverted than I used to be. I used to love to be out and about and doing stuff and being around everything. And now I just kind of like to drink coffee. And we didn't turn the TV on all day yesterday, did we? What is wrong with us? We will today. But she was out in the middle of nowhere. Imagine that. in a rowboat. I mean, a nice rowboat, but in a rowboat. And she had lost some of her supplies. She was hurting. She was crippling along, and she had one last way to get in touch with people, to call for help, and to let folks know that she was in need. I want you to open up your Bibles to Judges chapter 7. I'm going to come back and finish her story in just a minute. But in Judges chapter 7, we read about Gideon and the Israelites. If you're familiar with Judges, let me give you the story of Judges again and again and again and again and again. Read Judges. It's kind of like a broken record. Remember records? Kids these days don't know what a broken record. Okay, it's a broken record. In Judges, here's what would happen. The children of Israel, now the nation of Israel, has come to the promised land. And they begin to worship false gods. They rebel from God. God told them, if you follow my instructions, if you will obey me, I will bless you, I will protect you, I will take care of you, you will prosper. Your enemies will not win and victor over you. If you will follow me, if you will obey me, I will make things good for you. I will help you. I will take care of you and protect you. And so the cycle of Judges is this. The people rebel. God allows the enemy to come in and do what he told them that was going to happen. God allows an enemy to come in. God allows the enemy to come in and begin to crush the nation of Israel. And then in their need, they call out for God. Now, before we ding them too harshly, that sounds like us sometimes too, right? Okay, we go out and do things our way. How's that working out for you? Not all that well. Life begins to hurt us and harm us, and we begin to reap the results and the consequences of that rebellion. So we began to be in need. We call out to God, and because of God's goodness and God's grace, not because we deserve it, but because of God's goodness and His character and who He is, He responds to us. See, I'm a dad. Sometimes I want the boys to kind of hurt for a while, right? God's a good dad. God's a good father. He allows His children, the nation of Israel, He allows them to feel that pain. So they call out to Him. So in Judges chapter 6, we meet Gideon. One of the nations that rises up against the Israelites are the Midianites. And the Midianites have come and they have just completely wiped out Israel. They've overrun them. They are ruling over them. They are kind of guerrilla warfare. They camp out around the outside of Israel, and then every time the harvest comes in, they come in and plunder. They were countless. It said that they were like the locusts, like a locust swarm. You couldn't count the camels, it says in chapter 6. And all of a sudden, Gideon, who's this Israelite man, and he says about himself, I am the least important member of my family. My family is the least important in our tribe. And my tribe, Manasseh, is the least important in all of Israel. So you go to the big shots in Israel, this defeated country. You go to the big shots in Israel. No, we're not going to go to them. You go to the smallest tribe, the smallest family, the least important member, and an angel shows up. Not because Gideon's good, but because God is good. An angel shows up, looks at Gideon and says, "Greetings, mighty warrior." You know what Gideon was doing when the angel showed up? Hiding. You know what threshing wheat means? Okay, wheat, you got to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so you beat it. You know, you beat it. You hit it hard to separate that wheat from the chaff. And then you throw it up in the air in some windy place on a hilltop or up on a broad plain. And the wind blows away that chaff. He was hiding in a wine press. Wine presses have walls. Very little wind in a wine press. He was hiding, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff, trying to get just enough grain for them not to starve. He's hiding, and the angel shows up and says, "Greetings, mighty warrior." That says a lot about God. Not about Gideon, that says a lot about God. We see in Judges chapter 6, we see that the people are still in rebellion. The people are still worshiping false gods. They're crushed by the Midianites. They're defeated by the Midianites. They are at the whim and at the will of this overpowering foreign army. And they're calling out to God, but even in their calling out to God, they're still worshiping false gods. And so in chapter 7, Gideon has put out a rally cry because the angel came and said, we're going to defeat the Midianites. Gideon goes, for real? Will you let me test that? And so he puts God through a couple of hoops. Remember the whole laying out the fleece thing? That's chapter 6. You can read that later. So in chapter 7, Gideon has gathered 32,000 men to fight the Midianites. Would you stand up with me? I want to read from God's Word this morning. Judges chapter 7, starting in verse 1. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left. 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank, cupped hands, lapped like dogs. All the rest of them got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, isn't that weird? God's weird. With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. This is the word of the Lord. You can be seated. Now here's the scene. We find out in chapter 8 that the Midianites have an army that's 135,000 strong. Already, in verse 1, already the Israelites are outnumbered 4-1. Already. God comes along and says, this is another one of those instances. It doesn't say it in the scriptures, but I've just got to believe that God in heaven elbows somebody and goes, watch this. 32,000 versus 135,000. They're outnumbered 4-1. God looks at Gideon and says, you've got too many. Again, it's not in the scripture. But Gideon had to have looked at the Lord and said, what, seriously? We're outnumbered 4-1. God says, yeah, too many. Why? Hang with me. 32,000, he says, tell everybody who's scared to go home. Now, I did not serve in the military. I'm not sure that's ever been an option. Has it been? Okay. Yeah, I don't remember, I've watched a lot of war movies. Seriously, and I say this with as much humility as I can, that's as close as I've got to the battlefield. But I've paid attention. I've learned a few things about war from the movie theater seat. Okay? I've never seen it said, I've never heard it said, I've never observed, hey guys, if you really don't want to fight today, you can go on back. It's okay. 32,000 is the army. 32,000 to fight 135,000. And he says, if you're scared, you can go home. 22,000 jet. We're out of here. I'd like to think that I would have been one of the 10,000. Follow me. That's my best army type thing. I'd like to think that I'd have hung in there. 22,000 out of 32,000 are gone. 10,000 remain. Now, the Midianites' numbers haven't changed. Now it's 10,000 against 135,000. Now it's not 4-1 odds. Now it's 13-1 odds. God looks down at the 10,000 brave little Israelite soldiers and says, no, still too many. And the Bible doesn't say it, but Gideon had to have gone, seriously? Said, no, separate them again. Take them down to the water and let them drink. Now, I've heard this passage preached a couple of different ways, and it's weird, it's goofy. I don't know that there's anything super spiritual about getting down on your knees and chucking your head down in the water like you're bobbing for apples and slurping up a bunch of water, or reaching down, scooping it up, bringing it up to your mouth and lapping like a dog. But any way that God did this, he separated the 10,000. 300 men went down, got water, and brought it up to their mouth, and 9,700 men got down, chucked their head in the water, and slurped it up like that. And God said, keep the 300, send the 9,700 away. Now, I've lost track of math, but now it's 300 Israelites versus 135,000 Midianites. And God says, yeah, that ought to do it. Why does God do stuff like that? Why does God do stuff like that? Now, some of you probably know where this is headed. Okay? Why not just let 32,000 Israelites fight the 135,000? Come to a mighty puncher's, that's how Rocky beat Apollo. It was 4-1 odds. It had to have been. But Rocky won. He had a puncher's chance. He hung in there. The Italian stallion would not stay down. Why not let 32,000 fight? Why not just send 22,000 off because they're scared and let the 10,000 fight? Why did God take them all the way down to 300? Glad you asked. As usual, God has a reason and a purpose for what he did, for what he says, for what he asks his people to do, not just in the Old Testament in Judges chapter 7, but today. God wanted to teach his people in an overwhelmingly apparent way to rely on him. Now, folks, I want you to remember that. A couple of weeks ago, I preached about Peter. Remember Peter fishing with Jesus? They had fished all night and had caught nothing. He was back at the shore, cleaning up his nets, going to go home, have a bite to eat, sleep throughout the heat of the day, get up in nighttime, and fish all night again. Jesus comes along morning, afternoon, goes, hey, Peter, let's go fishing. Peter rolls his eyes, says, Jesus, you don't fish in the Middle East during the heat of the day. It gets hot. The fish go deep. We can't catch the fish when they're deep. Jesus says, don't bother me, boy, with details. Let's go fishing. And Peter responds, Lord, I fished all night. We caught nothing. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I want to go home. But because you say so, I will. In some way, Gideon had to have looked at God and said, seriously, we're outnumbered 4-1. And now you chased off 22,000 of my 32,000 army. Now you want me to send 9,700 home and keep the dog lickers. Really? That's my army? This makes no sense. We're going to get wiped out, and they're not even going to send their A team at us. They're going to give us their C team. They're going to take care of us before breakfast is done. Going to be back at the camp by time for coffee. But because you say so, I will. We will. There's obedience there. We so often put our faith, what do we put our faith in? Gideon put his faith in his 32,000. They were outmatched, but they had a chance. Gideon put his faith in his army, small as it was. What do we put our faith in? Our jobs, our checkbooks, our relationships, our smarts, our wits. What do you put your faith in? What you've got in the bank? the nest egg we've put aside. We put our faith in our strength, our contacts. It's all who you know, right? You put your faith in those things. God meets us not in our strength. God doesn't meet us where our checkbook is. God doesn't meet us in our wisdom. God meets us at our obedience. Folks, that's Bible. That's Bible. Let's go back to Milan Piquet. Okay? We left poor Milan in the middle of the North Atlantic. After coming through Storm Umberto, which is fun to say, she had dumped her boat repeatedly 3 times in one day, had lost her supplies, had lost her sea anchor, had lost 3 of her 4 ways to communicate. She used that last radio to call for help. It just kind of worked out that there was a ship in the area. And the ship responded to her distress call. And it had to have been tiny off as it's beginning to come. She just sees a tiny little dot. And the dot begins to get bigger. And she thinks help is coming. The dot begins to get bigger, and then it gets bigger, and then it gets bigger. The ship that responded that day was the Queen Mary II, the world's most luxurious ocean liner. She's out in the middle of the ocean in a rowboat. And she's left with nothing. And she sends out a distress call. And the Queen Mary II, here's what happened. The Queen Mary II, so big, it settled the waters. It did a lap around Milan. It did a lap, a huge lap around her rowboat to settle the waters. It dropped 5 watertight canisters into the sea, replenishing her supplies. That included a new sea anchor and a satellite phone, but also, get this, out in the middle of the Atlantic, here's what the Queen Mary drops off. Fresh fruit and vegetables, bread, pastries, chocolate, bottled water, coffee, duct tape, soap, shampoo, body lotion, and a postcard from the Queen Mary II. The entire scene was observed by all the passengers. These ocean liner people came out to the side of the ship where Milan was and watched the entire thing transpire. They lowered these watertight canisters and they blew them over. Basically, I don't know how boats operate, but they got these little, maneuver side jet. I watch Star Wars. I know how that stuff works. And so they basically blew it off at her. And it shot it toward her, but she still had to row over. She reaches over and they had to have been heavy. She reaches over and she's bringing them in one at a time. Finally, she's pulling the last one in and it falls off. It becomes unattached. The people on the side of the boat go, because they've been watching this whole thing and now one of the canisters is free. She reaches over at the last minute. She fights it over the edge of her boat. The people on the Queen Mary erupt in applause and she throws her arms up like this. And in 30 minutes, the ship was gone. It comes in and takes off. The whole thing took about 30 minutes. And now she's in the middle of the Pacific, and she's reprovisioned. She has communication. She has fresh pastries. There had to have been a fine French pastry chef on that ship. Ha ha! Here's what the captain of the Queen Mary said. "We are happy to have given assistance to Milan and help her recover from the damage inflicted by the storm. We wish her the very best of luck with her solo Atlantic rowing adventure." What an adventure. Milan said, "This is a dream come true. For me to see the Queen Mary in the middle of the Atlantic is something I would have never hoped for." So, in 4 months, she rowed 3,000 miles and reached the coast of Europe and landed in November in France. Amazing. But she didn't do it alone. Now go back to Judges. Let me read you the end of the story. In Judges 16, we see with 300 men, in verse 16, dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. So each company usually has a torch that they lift up. Gideon, little trickeration here, lit torches and put them in jars and sent 300 men out around the hills. And he sent them out and just told them to wait for the instructions. Watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all of those who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Gideon and 300 with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch of the night, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew their trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the Midianite camp to turn on each other with their swords. Amazing. But they didn't do it alone. We have a Queen Mary II size God. And we often have rowboat size provision. We often feel like we're in the tiny little broken, dumped over, half provisioned rowboat in the middle of a great big Atlantic Ocean size world of trouble. And not just that, now we've been dumped 3 or 4 or 10 times by the storms that we go through, and we are at a loss, and the last thing we can possibly do is call out for help. Folks, we serve a Queen Mary size providing God. How in the world do you fight 135,000 with 32? We'll never know. Because it didn't happen. It went from 32,000 to 10,000 to 300. God then looks and says, now they can see that it's me and not just them. If they won with 32,000, they might get cocky. That's right. I was there. You should have seen. It was 4-1. I took out 25 of them. That's right. We bad. Okay, so that's pride. That's cocky Israel. That's we did it with 32,000. God says we can't have that. They'd think it was them. Folks, every now and then, God brings you to the point where you have no chance in the world except that God shows up and provides. He does that on purpose. Now, I don't like that. I wish I felt bulletproof all the time. I wish I could do it all in my strength. I wish that it was all me all the time and that I felt proud and I felt invincible. But God doesn't want that in my life. He wants me to rely on Him. This Canadian French-speaking woman rode 3,000 miles. She dumped that little boat. I'd have been scared the first time I went up and down the big 5-foot wave. Yeah, 5 foot. Don't tease me. I'd have been scared. The biggest obstacle she had to overcome, she was scared to go under her boat. She had to, out in the middle of the ocean, again, I've seen too many movies, out in the middle of the ocean, she had to swim underneath her boat to get the little living things on the bottom of her boat that were slowing her speed down. She had to get under there and scrape all that stuff off. She had to do that repeatedly. She knew that was going to freak her out before she even left the dock in Canada. She practiced that. She had to do that out in the middle of the ocean. You know what's swimming underneath you in the ocean? I don't. But she made it. She did it, but not by herself, not alone. Gideon won the day. We read in chapter 8, the victory was complete. Okay? Gideon and his soldiers God caused the Midianites to turn on each other, and 120,000, poof, were gone. And then Gideon and his boys his 300 boys, chased the rest of them down, 15,000 more in chapter 8. Amazing, but they didn't do it on their own. We serve a Queen Mary II size God. We try so hard to do things on our own, to make it on our resources, our strength, our wisdom, our reasoning, our money. We try and be so self-reliant. God often brings you to the point where you've gone from 32,000 to 300. Why? Because then you can see that it's not you. You probably weren't going to win with 32,000. But God wins with 300. Let me read you this quote and then I'll be finished. A.W. Tozier, pastor, writer, says this: "The power of God is at our disposal, waiting for us to call it into action by meeting the conditions that are plainly laid down. God is ready to send down floods of blessing upon us as we begin to obey His plain instructions." Does that mean that there are strings attached? Yeah. Folks, God calling out to the Israelites to begin with, "Greetings, mighty warrior," is an example of God's grace. They didn't deserve His rescue, but He began to send it when they didn't deserve it. Does that sound familiar? While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God extended His love for us far before we ever sniffed being good or being holy or being righteous. God sent His love to us. The fact is that God offers all that. That's His grace. But God's resources, blessings, rescue comes through obedience to His plan and His way. I don't think Gideon would have won with 32,000. But he won with 300 because he obeyed the Lord. Here in the next couple of weeks, I want you to listen for the Lord's voice. I want you to listen. And I want you to come to that point where Peter came in Luke chapter 5 and where Gideon did here in Judges chapter 7. When it does not make sense, when everything within you says, this can't be right, can you look to God and say, I don't get it, I don't understand, I don't like it, it doesn't make me feel good, but because you say so, I will. Would you stand with me? We're going to pray together. We're going to sing together. Would you pray with me?